will talk about there will be consequence. Mark, how can please start?
Thank you very much. So I proposed last year this project, living somewhere at the intersection between logic and social epistemology. And with the present talk, there will be consequence. I would like to share with you some of the concerns, some of the proposals and challenges that I have ahead of me in this project. Now, here's a place that became quite famous a couple of years ago. At that time, in Europe or elsewhere in the world, we were not so much worried about misleading information, especially those that has been so intensified through political polarization and fake news spread by social media. Now, can we talk about logic and can we talk about information without taking these social dimensions into consideration? Now, I claim that the game of giving and asking for reasons, which is one way of talking about logic, is quite hard to play with if we cannot count on certain kinds of certificates that will allow us to reestablish trust, which should be the ultimate aim of logic in modern world, if we can have any effect in it. Now, of course, nowadays there is a certain kind of amount of pessimism shared by a lot of people if whether we can reach rational solutions to political problems as 100 years ago. On the other hand, if we think about information, there are huge amounts of data out there, and it's pretty hard to think that it's neutral. So when is it that we can trust this information and use it for something that is going to help us? By the way, it might be interesting to point out, I didn't realize this until very recently, that the word disinformation seems to have been proposed for the first time in the title of a KGB Black Propaganda Department. Black propaganda is the one that's intended to look like it was created by those it's supposed to discredit. And nowadays it became such a popular word. Some of you might be missing the third element here of logic, language, and information. Now, it's very hard to claim that language is not contaminated by this disinformation out there. And obviously language is a social phenomenon, and it's not neutral by the way we use it. So what I wanted to call attention to is that it can also be liberating. Recently, we see that Ukrainians have been learning to use it on their behalf. And this is a picture I took 6 years ago, that's something you could buy anywhere in Kiev, subways to use at home. Of course, I have been instructed not to go into this politicized conversation. This is actually not fake news. This has been around in January this year, and that's great because I love this Monty Python episode. Okay. Now, what I wanted to question is whether perhaps we have been overestimating the truth. In the sense of our founding father, Frege, who would claim that the logic was the science of the most general laws of truth, or Boole in the 19th century. We have been educated in these traditions as being founding traditions of logic. But I would like to go a little bit back, or in the same period, and see what's going on with the notion of values in German philosophy, idealistic philosophy. So this is something which is pretty nice. You can find in the book by Heinrich Swansing and Jaroslav Schranko on how the value theoretical tradition in German philosophy was very important in defining the task of philosophy as the task of establishing the principles of the logical, the ethical, and the aesthetical assessments. By the way, in English, ethics and aesthetics has an S at the end, but logic doesn't. I don't know why. And it's also at that time Windelband proposed for the first time the term truth value, which is nowadays common parlance in our area. Now, can we really use theories of truth to elucidate these important uses of language, in particular the assertoric uses of language? That's one thing I would like to question today. As you have seen, we're in a path in which we can either ask for help or go towards truth and consequences, and I choose consequences, as from the title of my slides. But what kind of consequence? Those defined by inference or by entailment? Well, none. I just choose consequence, and I claim that not proof theory and not model theory is the thing which should be behind this study, but consequence theory. And we all know that there is at least one way of defining what consequence is in logic, which is the Tarskian approach to the notion of consequence, generalizing Kolmogorov's axioms on topology and closure in topology. Now, another way of writing this is in terms of a relation, rather than an operator on formulas, or sets of formulas. And one thing I should notice is that if you look at operators, it's very clear what it means for a theory to be defined. It's just a fixed point of that operator. And consequence relations allow us to recover proof systems and to recover logical matrices, because those induce consequence relations. And if you present them this way also, it's pretty easy to see through something that's sometimes called Sushko's thesis, that logic is inferentially two-valued. You need only two truth values to talk about, logical values to talk about logic. Now, what I propose here is to take a certain turn in another direction. I call it a nomadic turn, not a pneumatic turn, a nomadic turn. It comes from Greek, gignoschein. Gnome is perhaps best translated today in terms of opinion. But it's quite interesting that the only Western European language in which I find a cognate of that word is English, in the verb to know, which comes from gnome. So in the sense of perceiving or recognizing. Now, the question I'm interested here is whether agents, as the cognizant entities, they're looking for either knowledge or information. And in each case, what are the things that they are interested on? Are they the contents of, say, that information? Is it expressed through assertions or through opinions, which is what I'm proposing here? So basically the picture is, you have this agent out there, and I'm proposing that the agent is not the origin of information, but that the agent looks around and entertains certain kinds of cognitive attitudes with respect to certain information quanta. Okay, now I don't have to clarify what I mean by this new extended theory of judgments. Is it about putting things on their boxes? Well, maybe it is. Maybe it's about piling things on top of each other. But let me propose here something operational about logic. Let me take this following intuition that logic is always concerned with certain kinds of properties which are being assigned or propagated among sentences or sets of sentences, and that the logical theories, they contain precisely the objects that have those properties. Now, according to that approach, one might imagine that whatever notion of consequence you have, this is going to affect your theories which contain all the kinds of judgments in it. For instance, if the only thing I can talk about is this side of the moon, what about the dark side? Does it hide anything? Well, in fact, even the name dark side of the moon is a misnomer, as the other side of the moon receives as much light or even more than this side because it doesn't have the eclipse of the Earth. But I also learned very recently that the other side of the moon has very different chemical constitution as this side of the moon. So it might be interesting to explore it. And that's what I set myself to do. So one usual assertion that people put in their general theories about logic, one usual judgment is the judgment of assertion. And I propose that we should also look at denials. I'm not the first one to do it. But what I want to write here is that one could have these two primitive judgments living together in a bilateralist approach, and one could define a certain notion of what I call judgment compatibility. Some people have been calling this counter-exempling relation, but I don't find it so interesting. But what would be the judgment compatibility relation? It would be some kind of idea that you're taking sets of formulas and you are disallowing certain kinds of things, such as gluts and gaps, or that you are, let me put it like this, which is even perhaps easier to read. If you are willing to assert all this and deny all that, maybe you should also be willing to assert part of what you did before and deny what part of what you did before. So these are properties that would explain what I mean here by judgment compatibility relation. And what I wanted to mention is that if you take the complement of it in terms of this set here, then you have what's in the literature called generalized consequence or multiple conclusion consequence relations. I call it S consequence. And the single conclusion counterpart is a T consequence relation that which I presented before. Now, if you are willing to consider even more general notions of judgments and you're willing to allow for gluts or willing to allow for gaps, then you're going to have more logical values than the two logical values we're used to. Okay, now there is a notion of theory pair out there which you might be interested in looking at, which takes both into consideration. But what I wanted to do is a further generalization. Instead of assertions and denials, I would like to propose that the cognitive attitudes that agents have might be taken as acceptance and rejection. So generally, denial is taken as the complement of assertion, as you have seen in the previous slide, but I would like to keep these things separate. What about if I have these attitudes which are independent of each other? Well, maybe a picture like this could be drawn, in which you have an agent perhaps accepting, saying yes to a certain proposition, or an agent rejecting a certain proposition or the content of it. And the non-acceptance doesn't need to coincide with rejection, and the non-rejection doesn't need to coincide with acceptance. And actually, these things together make a beautiful square of oppositions in which you have contradictoriness living here as usual. You have a certain kinds of antonymy relations here and duality relations here. So acceptance and non-rejection are dual attitudes. Okay, now another way of looking at this is if you take the bilattice, which has appeared in several talks over here for FDE or something like this, and you start focusing on the edges rather than the nodes, then what I mean by acceptance would be this position here, in which you could either be talking about this truth value or that truth value. And if I do want to talk about this truth value, then I would select the attitudes of acceptance and non-rejection at the same time, because both meet here. Okay, so I can recover truth values from that approach if you're missing them. Now, a further generalization is the idea that actually maybe logic should have more dimensions, even more judgments or more ways of keeping these things apart. So now that I have all these cognitive attitudes, I propose that we should start moving away from this world in which things are either on the left or the right, or that things have only one dimension. Now, this has happened with inhabitants of Lineland when they discovered that they could see two-dimensional pictures in a certain way using movement, and by the inhabitants of Flatland when they discovered that there would be three-dimensional things out there. Now, can we do logic like this? I won't show you. It would be just flashing the definitions of what logic would look like. We have with a 2 times 2 dimensional instead of a 2-dimensional with a 4 positions instead of just 2 positions left and right. So I just say that it's possible to do it. There is a notion of consequence we call B consequence. There are proof systems which are adequate for them, and there's a notion of entailment which is very natural associated to these 4 cognitive attitudes that I mentioned before. Okay.
Well, if
yes.
I may, 1 second, interrupt
yes, sure.
you. So the 15 minutes are up.
Yes, I have 2 slides.
From now on, every time, every minute that you speak is less.
I understand.
Questions.
Yes, I just have these 2 slides. This is the one in which I say that this is the thing which I find most urgent to develop, and I haven't, because it's so important now that we have agents and they live in a society to use some tools from social choice theory to put and aggregate this information and the relations in between these tools and what they do and the kind of developments that I'm defending here in terms of consequence have pretty much not have been explored yet. So it's part of the project, and I can't pay anyone. All the money I have for the research this year has been spent in this conference. But if you would be willing to work on this, I would very much be interested in collaborating. Now, the goal, of course, is to, after you aggregate judgments, you would like to perhaps would do some consensus reaching. So tools are out there. We need to combine them with this generalized approach to judgments. Now, as a conclusion for this, I just wanted to mention that there are a lot of challenges ahead, as you know, in all respects. And I wanted to dedicate this talk to friends in Ukraine who have been going through this and have kindly invited me to go there 6 years ago, and it was so important to be there. And I wanted to quote what Yaroslav, I think he's here, but he wrote to me, and let me disclose it, a very beautiful message 6 weeks ago, in which he said, "I am sure we will be able to see each other soon and discuss not only logic, but also the issue of how such sort of things, which we now have in Ukraine, can be happening in the modern world." Now, that being said, I wish for peace, and I'm willing here to answer questions and take suggestions from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's all thank João. Yes, if you have any questions, please write Q in the chat. It's the fastest to attract my attention, and I'll give you the word. Any questions? Yaroslav.
Thank you, João, for very interesting, excellent talk. So just one question for understanding. So you said there that agents are looking for, you made a dichotomy, are looking for either for knowledge or for information. Should we say that they are looking not just for information, but for true information? Who wants false information? So if agents are looking for true information, but then actually it again means that they still are looking for knowledge.
Yes.
True information, then they need next step, justify it, and then we get knowledge.
Yes. Thank you very much, Yaroslav. Very good to see you here. I'm very much in doubt nowadays whether we can still keep that aim of demanding information to be as pure and good as we would like it, so as to be true. But what I'm proposing is that we take seriously into account the fact that agents do have opinions on what they hear, and either they will act rationally on top of those opinions and those cognitive attitudes that they have towards certain pieces of information, or not. And maybe logic could still, that's my proposal, help understand what happens even in that situation in which we don't have that, we're not sure about the truth of the data, if you're talking about information, but we can still and should still be able to do things about it, and perhaps do rational discussions about it, aggregate information, and not think of logic as being any more the tool for reaching truth or collecting truths, but more like the way of dealing with it, dealing with what we actually have in the world out there, which will be contaminated and which will be incomplete.
Okay, thank you. There is another question by Harry, but we don't have time. Sorry, Harry. We are getting over time now. The next talk, so we have to move on. Thank you again, João.